I've been interested in Shakespeare from an early age. But it took me a long time before I started any research on Shakespeare. At university I studied geology, not English literature. When I looked at the sonnets, there were a few things that stood out as rather unusual. The first was the age difference between the poet and his subject, the fair young man who is referred to as my lovely boy in the sonnets. He was probably in his late teens or early 20s. Shakespeare describes himself as older, not only older, but near death. In Sonnet 45, he writes, for example, "My life sinks down to death, oppressed with melancholy." References to death like this are frequent in the sonnets. It seems likely that the poet was in his 50s or 60s. Few Elizabethans lived any longer, but scholars have established that most of the sonnets were written in the 1590s, when Shakespeare was in his 30s. He wasn't about to expire. The second curious fact is that during his lifetime, almost no one referred to Shakespeare's personal qualities, but people did refer to his works. The third curious fact is that Shakespeare's works reveal a vast knowledge of classical literature. This includes books only available in French, Italian, Latin or Greek originals. But we have absolutely no record that he ever learned these languages or even owned a book. And finally, there is no independent evidence whatsoever that Shakespeare had a close relationship with a young man. For me, these observations suggest that something is wrong with the traditional story of the brilliant Warwickshire countryman who became England's most famous playwright. My aim in writing this book was not to present yet another plausible idea about the authorship of Shakespeare's works, but to gather together all the evidence relevant to the subject matter of the sonnets in order to see where it led. It's the evidence that matters. Shakespeare didn't keep a day-to-day diary, but the sonnets seem to be a diary of sorts. The author meets a young man. He's impressed by the young man's looks. Everything seems rosy. We read in Sonnet 18 the gloriously happy lines of "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" But then negative thoughts creep in. The relationship is moving from simple admiration to something more complex and more like real life. Two people trying to make a relationship work, despite disagreements and difficulties. It all seems so genuine and modern. I concluded that the sonnets could indeed be a diary. At least this was an idea worth investigating. And if the sonnets are a diary, they are likely to contain references to outside events and other people. These could help us identify the young man who is the subject of the poems, and perhaps tell us something about the poet too. For example, after his first appearance, the young man is often away on unspecified journeys. Some of these trips are sea voyages, and others appear to involve danger and military campaigns. He is argumentative and attracted to other lovers. He has his portrait painted and is praised by poets. Only aristocrats lived like this. At the time that Sonnet 112 was written, he seems to have died. So going through the sonnets, I gathered all the personal and impersonal events like these that might match events and people recorded in the historical record. Of all the possible candidates for the honour of being the lovely boy of the sonnets, only Queen Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, has a life history which fits the sequence of events found in the sonnets. But here we strike a problem. There is absolutely no independent documentary evidence at all that Shakespeare ever had a close relationship with Essex or ever met him. Another problem is that Essex was only a year or so younger than Shakespeare, so the great age gap between the poet and the lovely boy referred to in the sonnets is inexplicable. A third problem is that Essex was Queen Elizabeth's favourite. She was undoubtedly attracted, and we might say infatuated, by Essex's boyish energy and good looks. She would not have tolerated a competitor for Essex's attention from someone like Shakespeare. So we reach an impasse. While Essex seems to be a perfect fit for the subject of the sonnets, Other evidence suggests that he can't have been. There is a way out of this impasse. It involves a radical change in conventional thinking. Maybe the sonnets are about Essex, but were not written by Shakespeare, but by a much older person. This thought led me to investigate the possibility that Elizabeth I herself wrote the sonnets. Naturally, the first reaction of most people would be to say that this proposition must be nonsense. Isn't there a huge amount of evidence that Shakespeare wrote the sonnets and the other works attributed to him? The simple answer is no. His name certainly appears on the title page of the sonnets, as it does on many of his published plays. But this does not amount to proof that he wrote these works. When you systematically study the sonnets, you find numerous allusions that fit with royal authorship. For example, red and white roses, locking up jewels before travelling, playing musical instruments, miniature paintings, fine clothes, horses and hunting, allusions to kings and queens, and their aristocratic habits. They are too numerous to list here, but readers can read more about them in my book. All the pieces of evidence I have gathered, while not conclusive on their own, cumulatively point to the same conclusion. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, is the primary subject of the sonnets, and Queen Elizabeth is their author. In contrast, nothing that we read in the sonnets can be matched to Shakespeare's life history. Thank you for listening, and if you want to learn more about Elizabeth, Essex and the sonnets, I encourage you to read my book.